Ever get that feeling where you really want to dive deep into something, a complex situation? Maybe you get the full picture, but then you realize just how much you'd have to read all the documents and details, and it's kind of overwhelming.
Oh, yeah, totally. I feel that all the time.
Right. So that's where we come in today on the deep dive. We're going to take you on a journey through some fascinating documents. And this time, it's all about a man named Sergyj Czornonoh. Now, this guy made some pretty remarkable claims concerning Lee Harvey Oswald, and you guessed it, the assassination of President Kennedy.
Absolutely. And what we've got here is a real mix, a collection of Mr. Zorno's own letters and then some internal correspondence from the CIA that relate directly to his allegations.
Okay.
And it gets pretty interesting because these documents, they start in 1978 and really give us a glimpse into how at least part of the U.S. intelligence community started to deal with these claims.
All right, so let's break this down for everyone listening. Our goal today is to really get to the bottom of what Mr. Zorno was alleging and to see how the authorities began to respond based on the paper trail we have.
Sounds good.
Let's start with his first move. He wrote a letter dated March 15, 1978, directly to the British ambassador in Washington, D.C. What jumped out at you from this first letter?
Well, right off the bat, what's really striking is the sheer scope of his claims. I mean, he goes way back to July 1963, talking about an incident at the airport immigration office in London. He says a police officer interrogated him there, and get this, the officer actually told him he looked like Lee Harvey Oswald.
Wow.
Yeah, and not only that, but the officer said Oswald was in London at around the same time.
That's a pretty wild thing to be told, especially knowing what would happen just a few months later.
Yeah.
But there was more to this letter, right? Didn't he also bring up a conversation that happened in Vienna?
Oh, absolutely. He claims that while he was in Vienna, he spoke with an officer from the USSR embassy. And this officer told him that an American defector, well, he's strongly implied, it was Oswald had gone back to Russia and was actively preparing to assassinate President Kennedy. So already in this very first letter, you've got these two potentially huge pieces of information. The resemblance and Oswald supposedly being in London, and then this claim about the Soviets knowing in advance.
It's like he's dropping these pieces of a very unsettling puzzle.
You got it.
Then he mentioned seeing Oswald's name in a Washington newspaper before the assassination even happened, and a police officer supposedly confirmed that finding this wouldn't have been difficult. It's so specific, but also somehow feels vague. What do you make of that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It makes you wonder what kind of publication it was and why Oswald's name would have been there before November 1963. Was it just a small mention in a local paper, maybe related to his time in the Soviet Union? Or was it something bigger, something that should have raised red flags? Now, Zorno himself says he's searching British intelligence files for this very information, so he's trying to verify his own memory, which is interesting.
And it's really telling that he's reaching out to the British ambassador, asking for help to uncover the truth and to officially document his account. He wanted his own government to have it on record. It wasn't just some fleeting thought for him. He even mentioned sending copies of this letter to some major players in the U.S. at the time, like President Jimmy Carter and Senator Daniel Inouye, who was on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. He even sent a copy in Russian to the Russian ambassador. Clearly, he was determined to be heard at the highest levels.
No doubt about it. To me, this shows he truly believed this information was crucial and needed to reach the right people in both the U.S. and maybe even the Soviet Union. Adding his U.S. passport number to the letter, well, it connects these claims directly to him and in a way adds a level of, trying to be verifiable, at least in terms of who is making these allegations.
Now, there's a second letter also from March 15, 1978 that seems to be a retyped version of some of those initial claims, but it also adds some new and really dramatic allegations, specifically about August 1963 and events that supposedly took place in Sofia, Bulgaria. What stood out to you in this second account?
Well, here's where the story takes a big turn, both geographically and in terms of the people involved. Zorno says he was in Sofia, Bulgaria, and that a U.S. government official told him Lee Harvey Oswald and a Russian woman named Basara Asanova were in his room on August 14, 1963. And even more chilling, this official supposedly said Oswald would go on to kill President Kennedy.
That's a very direct and disturbing prediction, allegedly made months before the assassination. And the claims from Sofia don't stop there, do they? He also describes an encounter at the Sofia airport later that same month.
Right. He claims that an American vice consul, who he believes was a Mr. Tom Blackshear, basically backed up the information, saying Oswald had a weapon and orders to kill someone. This vice consul even supposedly said Oswald was preparing to kill President Kennedy and that he, Mr. Blackshear, would personally wire this information to the Department of State. So, if true, this would be a huge instance of foreknowledge within the U.S. government.
It's almost unbelievable, these layers of alleged warnings. Then the timeline shifts to Washington, D.C. in August 1963. What did Mr. Czornonoh claim happened there?
So he says he went to the Special Counselor Service Department of State and spoke with a Mr. Kippingen, the director. He told him everything he knew about Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, what's interesting is that, according to Czornonoh, the director didn't specifically name President Kennedy, but he did say that Oswald would be killed after assassinating Kennedy.
That is a very specific and unsettling detail. And the claims get even stranger right. He says the director also mentioned Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. being assassinated, and that a man who was in prison at the time implied to be James Earl Ray was innocent. These are massive allegations to make against a State Department official.
They really are. And he doesn't stop there. He goes on to say that this information was only revealed to him after FBI agents used anesthesia gas on him to try to induce amnesia. He also alleges that the director at State told him Oswald had a weapon and would come to see him, implying an ongoing threat even then. And to top it off, he says he wrote to both the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate Select Committee on Assassinations about these events. So again, you see this persistent effort to get his claims investigated.
It's an incredible string of increasingly serious, almost conspiratorial claims. It really makes you wonder about Czornonoh's state of mind at the time and how reliable these detailed memories actually are.
Yeah.
But regardless, these are the claims he was putting out there for the record. Now, along with these letters about what he supposedly knew in advance, we also have a letter from February 1978 to a Mr. John H. Price. This one details some pretty disturbing allegations of harassment. What did he report in that letter?
This letter shifts the focus. It moves away from those 1963 events and into Czornonoh's experiences in 77 and 78. He says he spoke with a deputy district attorney about harassment from FBI agents and Secret Service using police department doctors. He claims they tried to use anesthesia gas on his building manager, poison him, keep him from sleeping, make him bleed, all sorts of things. He called them police state acts.
Those are some serious accusations of direct harm and interference. And the incidents he describes from early 1978 are equally troubling.
Yeah, he talks about this incident in Sacramento where a man he believes was connected to law enforcement or the Justice Department tried to give him a gun and pills and told him to go to Shreveport, Louisiana to tell a Mr. Sergeant Shriver that he was missed. He even claims a Mr. Veal at his hotel confirmed these instructions. Then in February 78, he says police intelligence told him an assassination, probably a threat against him, wouldn't happen there and that he should move to Maryland.
It paints a picture of a man who felt very much under threat and believed he was being targeted. He even mentions asking a Dr. Frederick S. Baker to look at surgery reports from January 78 because he had bled that day and felt weak. And then there's this cryptic statement about the right wing in America making a record to use against him in an assassination. It's a very unsettling picture.
It is very fragmented and hard to follow at times, but the underlying message is clear. Czornonoh believed he was being harassed and that speaking out about the Kennedy assassination had made him a target. It raises a big question. How much do these later claims of harassment affect how we view those earlier memories?
That's a great question. Now let's shift gears and look at how these claims were received, at least by the U.S. intelligence community. We have a CIA routing and record sheet from April 3, 1978. What does this document tell us?
This document gives us our first look at how Czornonoh's allegations landed on the CIA's radar. It says the communication was received on April 3, 1978 from MI6 British intelligence in Washington. It was then routed to different parts of the CIA, including CIRNA. Now that likely stands for Counterintelligence and Research Analysis, which suggests the CIA was initially looking at this from a security angle. The document also went to someone named Russ Holmes.
So the British took that initial letter to the ambassador seriously enough to share it with the CIA. That seems like a pretty significant step in how these claims were officially handled.
It is, and the comments on the sheet also say another copy was being held in the CIA's European branch, and that any reply should be sent there to be forwarded to London. This suggests they expected some back and forth with the British on this matter. What's especially interesting is a note from someone with the initials RBH. It mentions that Richard A. Sprague, who's chief counsel and director of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, the HSCA, had seen a copy of a letter from December 4, 1976, addressed to Sergyj Czornonoh. So this reveals that Czornonoh had been trying to bring this information to the HSCA at least a year and a half before these 1978 letters.
That's a huge piece of the puzzle. He wasn't just suddenly coming forward in 78. He had already contacted a major investigative body, the HSCA, much earlier. Now, we also have a letter from a D.H. Jones to a Mr. A.H. Stimson dated March 30, 1978. This seems to be the British side of that initial communication. What does this one tell us?
This confirms that the British were passing Czornonoh's correspondence through official channels. D.H. Jones specifically says he's enclosing the letters from Czornonoh and highlights the claim about giving information to the American vice consul in Sofia back in August '63. He also notes that copies were sent to the FBI and their own head office in London. So the British government was taking these claims seriously enough to share them within their own intelligence and law enforcement agencies, and also with their U.S. counterparts.
So you can see Czornonoh's allegations working their way into the system on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, while these 1978 documents show how his claims were first handled, we also have an older CIA dispatch from 1968. Now, this one isn't directly about Czornonoh, but gives us some context on the agency's overall approach to narratives that challenge the Warren Commission report. What's this dispatch about?
This 1968 dispatch is all about how the CIA was strategically responding to criticism of the Warren report, particularly because of District Attorney Jim Garrison's investigation. The CIA was sending out an article from The New Yorker that was critical of the Warren Commission because of Garrison's theory that there was a bigger conspiracy behind the assassination.
So even 5 years after the Warren report, people were still questioning it, and the CIA was actively monitoring and responding to these alternative narratives.
Exactly. The dispatch instructs chiefs, certain stations and bases, to use this article to brief contacts, especially government and political leaders. The goal was to reinforce the idea that there wasn't enough evidence to support any conspiracy theories. It emphasizes explaining how the U.S. justice system works and shooting down any anti-U.S. propaganda coming from Garrison's claims. This shows us how proactive the agency was in defending the Warren report against alternative explanations.
So they already had a playbook for dealing with people who questioned the official account. How might this strategy have affected how they approached Czornonoh's claims 10 years later?
That's a great question. It makes you think about whether they already had a system in place for handling dissenting voices on the Kennedy assassination.
Absolutely. Now, lastly, we have a letter from the Legal Center for the Disabled, dated March 3, 1978. This might seem unrelated to the Oswald claims, but it tells us a bit about Czornonoh's overall situation at the time. What does this letter say?
This letter is an acknowledgement from a paralegal at the Legal Center for the Disabled. They're confirming that they got Czornonoh's letter about his troubles with the police and the FBI. They specifically say they'll represent him if any legal action is taken against him. This suggests that Czornonoh wasn't just making these extraordinary claims about the Kennedy assassination, but he was also dealing with what he saw as serious legal problems, and he was actively looking for legal help.
So to sum it all up for our listeners, the key takeaways from this deep dive are pretty big. We've seen Mr. Czornonoh making some truly remarkable allegations about people knowing Lee Harvey Oswald was going to assassinate President Kennedy. These claims go all the way back to the summer of 1963 and span both Europe and the United States. We've also looked at his later allegations of harassment by U.S. authorities and his repeated attempts to bring this information to various groups like the British and American governments and congressional committees. And finally, we've seen the very beginning of the CIA's involvement with these claims through their communication with British intelligence. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of their efforts to push back against anything that challenged the Warren Commission's conclusions.
You can really see from these documents, even though they only give us a limited and fragmented view, a glimpse into a side of the Kennedy assassination story that isn't as well known. Czornonoh's claims, whether they turn out to be true or not, raise some huge questions about what people might have known before that tragic event and how that potential intelligence was dealt with by the authorities both then and in the years that followed.
It really makes you think about how complicated it is to uncover the truth about historical events, especially ones as huge and sensitive as this one. What other avenues of investigation do these documents open up for you? What questions do they leave you with about this pivotal moment in history and the stories that continue to surround it?
That's something I'm still pondering.
Me too. Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. We hope you found this exploration of Sergyj Czornonoh's claims as fascinating as we did. Join us next time as we continue to delve into the hidden corners of history, bringing you the stories and documents that make you think, question, and maybe even lose a little sleep.
See ya next time.
Bye, everyone.